Trump resists new gun laws after the Florida state shooting. Plus, he plans to skip the NRA annual meeting for the first time in a decade. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode, to kick things off, we want to talk about a story that's actually outside of the Reload, but it's hard to not talk about. And that is, of course, the mass shooting, or I guess attempted mass shooting at Florida State University that happened on Thursday. We're recording this on Friday. The limited information we have so far is that we know at least 2 people were killed and I believe 6 injured by a shooting carried out by a sheriff's deputy's son, a 20-year-old. And it's still early, details are fluid at this point. It's still relatively recent. But what we know so far is that, and we've seen at least a little bit of reaction from the White House.
Yeah. And first off, he used, I guess, his mother's service weapon, a handgun, for most of the attack. He also had a shotgun. And that's interesting in Florida just because they have age restrictions on buying any kind of firearm until you're 21. So, and then they also they bar people from carrying guns on campus as well. But we don't tend to cover these as breaking. We're not really a breaking news outlet. And we don't have the resources to send somebody to Florida State University like a lot of other major news outlets do. And so that's why we don't normally have a lot of in-depth coverage on these sorts of events until afterwards, especially if they have some sort of political implications, because that's more what we focus on, just to give people an idea of, our approach here at The Reload. But this does have, we did get comments, as you mentioned, from the president. President Trump in the Oval Office during a press conference where he talked about a lot of other things. Also was asked about this shooting and whether he planned to support any sort of new gun restrictions as a result. And he said no. Effectively, he said it's not the gun, it's the shooter was the line that he used. So very initial reaction to a very horrible event on the Florida State University campus, but one that that we wish we didn't have to talk about it at all, right? Like that these didn't happen. But and to be fair, well, excuse me, apologize. While this doesn't meet the Violence Project definition that we tend to go by here for mass shooting because they require 4 more people killed, it obviously is a similar type of event, where this person is trying to kill multiple people at random in a public space. And this doesn't appear to be tied to any sort of criminal activity, gang-related activity, drug-related activity. It's just appears to be a random shooting from some of the interviews, the press conference that the police held. And then I saw an interview with one of the survivors on CNN as well. That's the description. Matches what I think most people would imagine are a mass shooting to be, even if he did not actually manage to kill, thankfully, more people. So, but it's also, so it's not going to show up on that Violence Project tracker technically. And actually we haven't had a shooting that so far this year that is qualified with that 4 more killed standard. We only had 3 last year. So it's been a downturn recently. Usually you're seeing more like 7, 8, 9 a year in recent years outside of like COVID. Last year matched COVID as far as the Violence Project count goes. I know obviously there are other counts that are popular. And we've done whole episodes on this topic and best way to count or what's the most accurate. And at the very least, I think people should have an understanding of what you're saying. The gun violence archive, for instance, is the most popular one you'll see in media. It's also the one that gives you the largest number because it uses 4 more injured instead of 4 more killed. So, that obviously creates a very wide gap. Obviously, under that count, this would qualify as a mass shooting instead of usually hundreds of other shootings, and they don't filter out the criminal events, like gang shootings and things of that nature. But even under that count, I believe that these sorts of events have been down recently. And I don't think anyone really knows why. Obviously, the murder rate itself has dropped tremendously over the last several years. And I believe that's continuing this year as well, down below pre-pandemic levels. Maybe we'll have to have Jeff Asher on, the crime data analyst that we have had on previously to discuss these issues in the future. But I don't know, I don't know if that suggests that the two are connected and mass shootings are down because all sort of murders are down or not. I don't think that's always been the case in the past, but it is a kind of a fascinating situation where we just haven't had a lot of at least major mass shootings over the last 2 years, which is probably one of the reasons why guns have not been a major political issue during that time period. So it is wow, my voice is really, I apologize. It is a very difficult situation anytime one of these happens, and it is good that we are not seeing them as often. But it would be better if we could figure out exactly why we're not seeing them as often, and if we could prevent them outright, certainly. But so we had this terrible shooting at the campus of Florida State University, and President Trump reacted to it, saying he's not interested in pursuing new gun restrictions over this shooting, which is something that we've talked about, being a major thing to watch from Donald Trump, because in the past, in his first term, after major mass shootings, ones that generated enough political pressure and public attention and outcry, he did waver in his opposition to new gun restrictions on multiple occasions, both publicly and behind the scenes. So the El Paso shooting, reportedly he considered backing an assault ban, but was talked out of doing that, including by the NRA, actually, at the time. Then there was obviously the Las Vegas shooting, where he did back the bump stock ban, which he imposed unilaterally through ATF rulemaking, something that President Biden would go on to replicate a number of times, which President Trump is now starting to work back against. And then obviously the bump stock ban was found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Then you also had the wake of Parkland, where he publicly said that he believed that the government should take guns first and have due process second, backed essentially a red flag style bill. So did the Attorney General, Pam Bondi, who was Attorney General in Florida at the time. And that's where some of these restrictions that we mentioned briefly at the beginning came from. The ban on selling guns to anyone under 21 comes from that Parkland aftermath. So it is interesting to see his reaction, though, being one of not backing any sort of new gun restriction, at least initially in his very first comments on this. So we'll obviously keep an eye on that, how it goes, from here out. If pressure builds, whether the president moves at all, that'll be the thing to watch. So speaking of which, he made some other news this week, right? That we broke, actually.
Yeah. So for the first time in a decade, Trump will not be speaking at the NRA's annual meeting. This was just announced. And like you said, you broke the news. You have the story on the site. But so, yeah, since 2015 is the last time that he was not a speaker at their annual meeting. And the NRA claims it has to do with scheduling conflicts. Mm-hmm. And the White House hasn't said anything to you. I know you reached out to try to get some clarification, but as far as we know, that's all we have at this point.
The White House hasn't said anything to anyone on this, on their decision not to attend the NRA annual meeting, but we know it's not happening. And it's the first time since he started running for president back in 2015. He went to every single NRA annual meeting and spoke at it ever since. Obviously, there were 2 canceled during COVID that he didn't speak at because they didn't have them. But every other one he's been to, even at the height of the NRA's corruption trial, he was there. In fact, compared his own legal troubles to the NRA's. So, why he's backed off now is, it's interesting that he's doing it now and not back then. I think, I have sources that I've spoken to, including one that had knowledge of the discussions between the two sides on this, basically says that Trump, after all of this scandal and fallout and their decline in membership and revenue and political spending and new leadership, that he's just not, that they've fallen out of favor with him. He doesn't really know what's going on over there, what they do, or who's leading. Now, I mean, obviously, I think he probably literally knows who's leading, but the organization, because it has new leadership since LaPierre resigned. But, I guess he doesn't have any sort of close relationship with the new leadership or any close connection with them. So he clearly just doesn't value that connection anymore, which is this. And, this is not the first sign of that, right? Because he spoke at their event that they held in Pennsylvania in February 2024. That's where he made most of his gun policy promises during the campaign, was at that event, which he hasn't fully fulfilled yet. He was off on the timeline at the very least. He promised to roll back most of those Biden era ATF rules on the first week in office, if not the first day. And he didn't do any of that, but he has, in that timeline, he has started to do some of those things, like rolling back the zero tolerance policy for at the ATF for gun dealers. But, he then was supposed to speak at a October rally in Georgia that was hosted by the NRA. And he canceled on that one too, without explanation. The NRA, again, back then said it was a scheduling conflict, which, people can believe, people can, look at what's happened and assess for themselves, what's going on there. But it is also interesting. It's not as though he's replaced them with another group. This is where I think if you're a gun rights advocate, you might start to get concerned. I mean, a lot of people have soured on the NRA over the last several years, or didn't like the NRA in the gun rights movement because they thought they compromised too much or what have you. That's always been a critique from the right against the NRA. Groups like Gun Owners America have long held that position. But, the thing is, it's always been the largest and most influential group, and it still is. It still has millions of dues-paying members, which eclipses every other, not just gun rights group, but every other gun group in the country, even with all this backsliding and all the loss of membership, which has gotten to a very extreme point at the moment. They're still the most influential, still the largest. And if they lose influence and you don't see Trump moving towards any of the other groups necessarily, it's not like he's going to go speak at one of the other gun rights conferences. I think you start to wonder about that. Now, it doesn't mean, again, and it comes in the context of all the history that we talked about with Trump, especially after high-profile mass shootings, some of the actions he's taken or the comments he's made. If you don't have somebody in his ear from the NRA or another gun rights group, does his mind start to change on some of this stuff? I mean, obviously, if you go back before he was in politics, he was much more open to gun control measures like an assault weapons ban. He was in one of his books back in the 2010s. So, we'll have to see how that all shakes out, if anything changes. I mean, I think right now there's sort of the momentum of partisanship on the side of gun rights advocates at the moment in the Trump administration, just because by nature of how the gun issue has shaken out, Republicans are far more pro-gun than Democrats. And so if you have a Republican administration, unless leadership actively wants to change tact on how they approach gun issues, you're probably going to see pro-gun reforms down in the lower, down the line inside of the administration. And that I feel like is what we are seeing. It's not the top priority by any means. And I think Trump skipping the NRA annual meeting is evidence of that, more evidence of that, but it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be things that happen that the gun rights movement wants to see, and that they aren't going to be much happier or better off under this administration than under a potential Harris administration, right? So it's more a question of degree here, with the biggest risk being that Trump changes his mind and he can move the Republican Party toward gun restrictions better than I think anyone else. Is certainly better than a Democratic president ever could. He has the potential to do that. It's just a question of whether he ever would. And that's all signs so far point to no.
Yeah.
But that's the big risk that hangs over it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, it's symbolically relevant because, like you said, just by nature of coalitional inertia, you're going to see continued pro-gun rhetoric out of the Trump administration and rank and file Republicans. But without that sort of major institutional pressure player like the NRA, you certainly raise that risk of potentially straying or seeing things like pro-gun reforms get put on the back burner, which is kind of what we have been seeing. We've reported on this several times, how it's very clear that guns are not the priority that, say, immigration or XYZ issue is in the Trump administration. And no, go ahead. Sorry. I was just saying, I think it's safe to say that this is one of the major reasons why there's no major player there in Trump's ear saying, hey, you cannot take our issue for granted. I understand you have a lot to do, but our issue helped get you elected. And so we expect you to follow through. Yeah. And I wonder if he even believes that it helped him that much, or that it would be a big problem. Because look at the primary, right? You had somebody run to the right of him on guns in Ron DeSantis, and none of these gun groups anywhere along the line criticized Trump during that. They just didn't move at all or make any noise whatsoever. And DeSantis didn't appear to benefit in any way. And he appeared, frankly, to just give up on that as an issue altogether after pretty early on. So, I don't know that he feels vulnerable on this at all from these groups. And these groups, I mean, if you look at how they talk about everything he does, even if it's a very minor thing, I don't know why he wouldn't take them for granted, frankly, at this point. Again, that doesn't mean that there won't be pro-gun reforms, or that maybe this is the right path, especially with somebody like Donald Trump, who's very sensitive towards criticism and praise, right? Or it appears to be oftentimes. When you have at least some influence on an administration, you don't necessarily always want to go out in public and trash them when you could go in privately and have be more likely to get what you want that way. You're using more soft power in that scenario. So look, it's not always about just jumping on your political allies every time they do something that you don't want, or they don't move fast enough, going out and just haranguing them in public. That doesn't always work. But if you don't have that private ear either, then where are you, I guess, as move? I mean, just look at the Kash Patel thing, right? That was a huge
that was something that, for instance, GOA was very excited about him being made acting director at the ATF, and because he had spoken at their conference, and I think they viewed him very much as a fellow traveler and one of their guys. And it turned out that it doesn't seem like he was actually ATF director for very long, and there's no indication of how much influence he actually had in that role. And then they just swapped him out with another guy that no one has in the gun rights world had any connection with whatsoever. In Driscoll, the Army secretary, and they still got heaps of praise for doing that from all of them. Like we said at the time, I don't know that it makes any difference policy wise. It might not have a big impact, but it's just like it sure seems like the plan here is just to heap praise on almost literally anything that happens, and very much blow like the announcing the zero tolerance policy, right? That could have been gone day one. Why did they wait like 3 months for that? And we're not even sure how much it was still. It sure seems like it wasn't really being enforced anymore by that point. There was a whole lawsuit where they claimed to have changed this policy last year. I don't know. It's just a lot of things that where the executive order, we're announcing the review on stuff, like every little thing that gets treated as though it's a huge development. And it's not to say that these aren't, that this movement isn't in the direction that gun rights advocates want. The gun rights groups would be happy with the conclusion of them if they come to fruition. It's just, the approach here has clearly been to go very high praise on every small thing. And I don't know how much it's working or not. I mean, he doesn't feel the need to go and speak even at the NRA's annual meeting. Certainly for the NRA, I think that's a huge negative development.
Yeah,
because
I think that's absolutely.
They're so tied to him, right?
Yeah, I say they planted their flag early and firmly, and were prominently in his corner, especially during Trump 1.0. Wayne LaPierre was constantly with Trump, and they had that close connection. But none of this. Also, I think it's important to mention. None of this is to say is there's not necessarily any path back for the NRA to get back to that place. Right. I know you're having John Petrolino on the interview podcast to kind of talk about some of the ongoing developments at the organization to at least among some of the group to try to right the ship and get back to its former glory. And people can obviously tune into that to hear about, for example, the board election and the results we just got on that front. Right.
Yeah. The interview podcast will dive more into the NRA situation specifically, but look, Trump not speaking at an event is not the groundbreaking, earth shattering thing. Yeah. It's much more of a symbolic thing. I don't want to make too much out of it, like doing the opposite of what I was just talking about with the gun rights groups. But I think it's symbolically, it's a very negative development for especially the NRA, but probably the gun rights group, the gun rights movement overall. And it's really not clear who has an ear in the White House. FPC, I think, had a meeting with them. They seem to have at least adopted some of one of the things they wanted by announcing this task force at the DOJ. GOA seems to have some influence as well. And I'm sure the NRA still has some influence too, but I don't know that anyone has anywhere near the influence that Wayne LaPierre and Chris Cox, especially the NRA's former top lobbyists who got pushed out during their internal corruption fight, right? Like Wayne LaPierre pushed him out essentially at the time. Or at least, he was, he had much more of a close connection to Trump and especially Trump Jr. And he may still, but he's not with the NRA anymore. Right. And that's the problem. I don't know how many, if there have been any Oval Office meetings with any of the gun rights representatives this term. Now it's still early. Maybe it will happen. And maybe the NRA, if they can show that they've come out of their tailspin down the line and are able to flex political muscle again, maybe that will put them back into Trump's good graces, which he's pretty fickle on that front. So it's not like they could never get back in or whatever. It's just a bad sign for the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, we'll stay on top of all of this because this is obviously one of the big moving stories in the gun rights politics space, and obviously political influence with the current presidential administration. So stay tuned. Getting into some of the more state-related news, at least related to Massachusetts, we had a big major ruling from the First Circuit Court of Appeals. I think a ruling a lot of people expected just because of that court and the way that these sorts of cases have gone. But in this case, a 3-judge panel upheld Massachusetts' ban on so-called assault weapons, as well as its ban on ammunition magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds. So once again, another federal appeals court. It's been unanimous so far. Every single appellate court to consider one of these cases has upheld them. And we just have another one here up in the Northeast.
Yeah, ban on the sale of these items. Exactly the kind of thing that gun rights activists have been hoping to get the Supreme Court to overturn at some point, and there just hasn't been any success on that front. This one is basically identical to what they held in Ocean State Tactical, right? The Rhode Island case. Again, apologies to Rhode Island because Ocean State is not what I associated with them. My life, but as a Pennsylvanian, all of New England is just one blob to me. So, sorry to any of our New England listeners, but after looking at a map of Rhode Island, I was like, okay, this makes sense. Ocean, mostly it's like a beach state. Anyway, that's still sitting at the Supreme Court, that case, and it's how many times have they relisted that now?
I was going to say there's some serendipity with this ruling because it relied on Ocean State because the First Circuit decided Ocean State to uphold Massachusetts bans because they're similar, obviously in nature. The issue or the ruling came out the exact same day that the Supreme Court heard its 10th conference with Ocean State, and then obviously Snope, the Maryland assault weapon ban case. So the same exact time that they were being considered. One relying on the other, with gun rights advocates eagerly waiting for some, news from the court one way or the other, whether they're going to take the case or at least send it back to finish at the lower court. Really strange that they are just holding on to this one. I don't know what it means. I don't think anyone really knows what it means at this point. Sometimes if they relist it a couple of times, it's all right. Maybe somebody's waiting to write a dissent for a denial, but 10 relists. I don't know. What didn't the abortion case, Dobbs got like more than a dozen relists, right? I was going to say, I think it was like 14 where it was rescheduled for conference, and then eventually they decided to take it. So, nothing's dispositive, but it's certainly unusual.
So, who knows? It's another one of these tea leaf reading things with the court. You can't know for sure. You can kind of make educated guesses, but it's not really possible to have insight into why they're doing certain things the way they're doing them. But, this Massachusetts assault weapons ban case relies on the exact same logic as Ocean State Tactical. Essentially, like they do a Bruin test, but they point to gunpowder storage, and then they point to later restrictions on Bowie knives from the 19th century, and then 20th century restrictions on all sorts of firearms. And so the real question there is whether the Supreme Court will find that sort of spaghetti at the wall approach might be a way. They just kind of say any gun restrictions they can find from the era, or because gunpowder storage laws, hard to see how they're similar in the how or why for an assault weapons ban. But they claim it's because they were about preventing mass casualty events. So that's a very, very 10,000 foot view of how these things are similar. And it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court does with that sort of reasoning, if it ever does anything with it. I guess the outcome of Ocean State Tactical is going to tell us everything about this case. Now, if they decline to take these cases, I guess this could be one later on that they then reconsider down the line, because that's what, just declining to take a case doesn't necessarily mean the court agrees with the lower court's decision. You can infer that perhaps, but not always the case. They just might not be prepared to weigh in on the issue yet. And yeah, of course, the big problem goes back to what you mentioned at the top of this, which is that all of these assault weapons ban challenges have been, the laws have been upheld during them. And that goes back to a larger problem we've talked about before, where circuit splits. You're probably not going to see circuit splits on many of these hardware restriction cases because they're all from states that are themselves in liberal leaning circuits. So you're not going to get a Fifth Circuit ruling on assault weapons bans because nowhere in the Fifth Circuit is there ever going to be an assault weapons ban to rule on. So kind of an interesting paradox that, doesn't mean the Supreme Court can't take a case like that. And obviously they're considering multiple cases like that, but it lowers the odds, or lowers the at least the urgency. And as we've talked about before too, the court has very limited time and they don't take that many cases. So that can weigh against this sort of case. But I think the real drama is around these two cases in Snope and Ocean State Tacticals. Whatever they do with them will certainly roll downhill to these other cases.
I was going to say, our next update could be as soon as next Monday when they do an orders list, or Tuesday perhaps. Next week we'll know perhaps more. And of course, stay tuned to the Reload and we'll bring you guys up to date on all that. Other state news we want to touch on briefly is a story you had out of Montana, becoming the latest sort of red state to crack down on red flag laws. We've sort of seen this divergence since the Parkland years, where blue states adopt them and red states do everything in their path to prevent them. And in this case, the Montana legislature passed a bill to essentially ban red flag laws in the state.
Yeah, it's essentially a preemption law.
Yeah.
And it added to their long list of like preemption laws that they have in Montana. Just if you read the bill, it's like, okay, here's the 30th thing that localities can't do on their own. But anyway, that's essentially what it is. We've talked about preemption laws before in the past, mostly in regards to like concealed carry, or assault weapons bans or things of that nature. But this one applies to red flag laws. So I think it's the first I've seen, certainly. I don't know have you seen any other ones like this?
Yeah, there's been a few red states that have passed bills preventing localities, banning them at the state level, and then preventing localities from adopting their own. It's become one of these trends where like the safe red states adopt them, and it spreads like wildfire. And so there you go. I mean, this is I'm not surprised to hear that it's a trend. That's how gun laws work in the United States. You get a trend. You might have the first one gets adopted, and then similar states that have similar politics will also adopt them down the line. And so you see that on both sides of this. And so I guess this is perhaps the new trend in the red flag space of trying to make sure that even the localities or whatever don't try to adopt these. So interesting new tactic there. It's just an expansion of preemption and the continuing, I think, polarization of red flag laws. Because at first there was some, like Florida adopted one after Parkland, and there was some bipartisan momentum after that. And you got quite a lot of states, 20 some states, 21 have red flag laws now, but it hit a wall after a while. And it's become much more polarized since then at the state level, at the very least. Yeah. So Montana, should the governor sign it, has a chance to become that latest state to take the right-leaning path on these laws. So, and the spokesman there,
the spokesperson for Greg Giaforte. Sorry, please don't assault me, Governor. Anyway, he they said he's considering it. Yeah. I would imagine he's going to sign it.
I think he will too. Yeah. But getting into, as we're coming up on time here, just briefly want to touch on a couple more state updates from our newsletter links, both out of the Pacific Northwest, oddly enough. So out of Washington State, we have news that the legislature has essentially passed a permit to purchase mandate. They already had one for semi-automatic long guns. And now this would apply to basically all gun sales in the state. I think the two chambers have to do some confirming amendments because, different chambers pass different versions, but essentially it looks like Washington State will soon become the latest to require a permit and some live fire training before you can purchase any firearm.
Yep. And it goes to what we spoke to about Colorado last week, where I think, especially if this court does take up these sales bans at some point and strikes them down, then this is probably what you'll see more of are these permit to purchase laws. And then we'll have to see if the court revisits this idea of permitting down the line as well. But I think that's where you're going to see more and more of these permit to purchase laws. You probably see more and more of them regardless of whether the court strikes down those assault weapons bans, because the court has implied that permitting is not as severe and a restriction and could have a better chance of surviving scrutiny than bans do. So yeah, I would expect more of these down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. And then speaking of permit to purchase as well as hardware bans, news on Oregon's Measure 114, which is if listeners will recall, the ballot measure that required a permit to purchase as well as banned magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds. And it's been mired in legal fights ever since the 2022 election when it was on their ballot. The state appeals court, we reported this story a few weeks back, upheld that measure and said basically cleared a path for it to go into effect. And now gun rights groups are appealing to the state Supreme Court to try to get some final clarity, at least in the state court level, on whether or not that is constitutional. Yeah.
And so we will keep an eye on that to see how it turns out. Obviously, the Oregon State Supreme Court is probably not the most sympathetic venue for gun rights activists, but we will see. We will see what they do. I mean, that was a pretty narrow win in Oregon, even in a place like Oregon, which is pretty deep blue, but also mountainous and has a lot of presumably gun owners there. And so we'll have to see how it comes out in the state Supreme Court, and maybe if it goes to the federal appeal after that. Perhaps we'll watch the whole way and make sure that we're bringing you guys the latest news on it.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's I think all we got for this week, right? You have any fun plans this weekend?
I don't know. Well, Easter, obviously. Probably just go to church on Sunday. For the next 2 days, we actually just got a snowstorm randomly, and it was been like 70 or 80 degrees. And then now today it's gross and snowy outside. So it's classic. People that are familiar with Colorado know that is the nature of things out here. But yeah, I put the soft top on the Jeep last weekend, and now I think it's going to be 80 degrees here in Virginia. So might be taking the top off, taking it down at least. Got did a bunch of pre-tariff buying of things that I needed to buy. So I guess I'll have to put some of those together, a new coffee table, and got a security enclosure for the Jeep. I just bought one of those. So I'll have to put all that together this weekend. That'll be fun. Maybe go to IKEA and get some new dressers before the fiance moves in to my place. So busy weekend, I think. And then, yes, obviously Easter, and go to church. That should be a good time. But all right, well, that's all we've got for you guys this week. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on with Guns in America, you can head over to thereload.com and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. And then if you want to support the reporting that we do here, the one and only way to do that is by buying a membership over at thereload.com. That is how we are able to do this. We would not be able to survive as an outlet if we're not for our members. So go ahead and consider picking up a membership today over at thereload.com. That's all we've got for you this week. We will see you guys again real soon.